I'm Laura Blumenthal on the Berkshire Heroes podcast, and joining me today is Miles Evans, who is a trustee for the Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust, otherwise known as BBOUT. Welcome, Miles.
Hi, Laura. How are you?
Great, thank you. Thank you for joining me. Now, the charity was established in 1959 and focuses on increasing nature everywhere. This includes looking after 86 nature reserves, 4 education centres, and creating events and campaigns that increases nature for everyone. Now, you come from a business background. What attracted you to join BBOUT as a trustee, and what are the things that you've been involved with?
When you put it like that, it kind of feels exhausting. Albeit, I sit on the board, so I don't do the doing. But as you say, there's a huge amount that the charity does, which I'm sure we'll unpack over the course of this conversation. I think for me, I think there's a number of things really. I mean, I think there's a love of kind of wildlife and nature, full stop. I was very much, Laura, I was on the Attenborough bandwagon kind of before it got really popular. So knowing I was going to do this, I went and dug out the letter that I wrote to Sir David when I was 8. And somehow, and I don't know how, my mum managed to find his address. So we sent this letter to him. And he wrote me a handwritten note back, which still is on the wall today. And basically, I was just sort of saying to him, look, I think you're fantastic, and I think what you're doing is amazing, and what a great guy you are. And sort of, in the subsequent years, obviously everybody tends to kind of broadly agree with that. So, I mean, that's kind of, I think it started very early on. I mean, I grew up opposite Greenham Common. Ironically, sort of full circle, a flagship BBOUT site that the charity sort of manages now. I mean, when I was born, it was coming to its end of its life as an American Air Force base. In the Cold War, it was the longest runway in Europe. So to see that transform is amazing. And then I think, probably like a lot of people, like lockdown had a big impact. I mean, where I was living at the time, we had access to Greenham Common, we had access to the Nature Discovery Centre in Thatcham, we had access to Bowdown Woods. And the thing that sort of connected all of those was BBOUT. And there was this sort of realisation for me that that's amazing, that there's this group of people that are sort of keeping all these green, open public spaces going for the betterment of everybody. And that was a real, refuge for me at the time. I think probably like it was for a lot of people, right? We were cooped up indoors all day. And so I think all those things kind of culminated in me going, actually, do you know what? This is a really important thing. And I think maybe I've got some skills that could kind of help the organisation and help the charity. And so it just sort of all came together, really.
Fantastic. And I'm interested to get your take on, the Chancellor said that developers shouldn't be worried about bats and newts anymore. How did you feel about that? And if you can talk me through a bit more about how BBOUT uses its expertise to contribute to housing consultations to make sure that nature is protected.
Yeah. I mean, look, everybody loves a soundbite, right? So with a political hat on, she's making a point that she obviously knows is going to land well and play well in the media. I think put that to one side. I think I would be a hypocrite, would I not, if I sat here and started talking about the fact that we shouldn't be building infrastructure, because my career, to date has been pretty much infrastructure delivery. So I was, part of the team that helped deliver the Thames Tideway Tunnel in London, which is now sort of coming to completion. That's a big environmental project. Spent a bit of time on the Abingdon Reservoir, which looks like that's now kind of going to happen. Now working with Openreach, obviously, to install full fibre broadband across the UK. So I kind of do infrastructure. But then having said that, I don't think that growth on the one hand being the number one priority for the government and for the country, and environmental outcomes are mutually exclusive. I think you can have both. And I think nature and wildlife can, if you get it right, boost and enhance your growth prospects and your growth outcomes. And I think sort of trying to have one at the expense of the other is a bit of a dangerous game. In my experience, your question around kind of how does the charity sort of interact with kind of the planning process? I mean, in a previous life, I spent 4 years sitting on a planning committee. So again, a bit of a full circle moment. I used to be in receipt of some of this advice, but last year, 86% of the applications that BBOUT responded to at a local authority level were either withdrawn, refused, or they were amended. So there were better kind of nature environmental outcomes. And again, I mean, I wouldn't want to leave anybody sort of under the apprehension that the charity is in some way kind of anti-growth, or, anti-infrastructure. It's absolutely not. It's all about how do you make the best of what you're doing, and that is kind of exemplified, I think, in the way in which we kind of respond to those kind of planning applications.
Everyone I know love nature, they love wildlife. If you talk to children or retired folk, but we also know that we need to build houses, we need to build infrastructure. Miles, you and I are of the generation that we very much know we need houses. And how best can we balance the need for more building, but also protecting nature and wildlife? That is the £1 million question, really, which we've touched on a bit and just seems to be really difficult in the political sphere of getting anything done but making sure we're not damaging the environment.
It is a very good question, isn't it? And I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, to pick up on what you've just sort of said in your question, again, we are of that generation. I mean, I would not be on the housing ladder without Help to Buy, introduced by a previous government. The house I'm talking to you from now, was built last summer or finished being built last summer. I've only ever lived in, new build houses, right? So I think we accept the premise that more homes need to be built. I think I would caveat that by saying, if you take the government's sort of ambitious kind of 1.5 million housing target, they don't all need to be built in the south of England. So, I think previous iterations of the Conservative government, Johnson in particular, around this kind of idea of kind of levelling up the country, the prognosis there was the right one, in my view, which is how do you spread kind of wealth and opportunity, and therefore the housing kind of comes with it, the development kind of comes with it. So I think there's something in that. But I also think there's something in the way in which you build housing, which means that you are doing it in a far more meaningful and environmentally friendly way. So, for example, thinking about kind of green infrastructure. So, how do you make sure that as part of your development plans, you are building in green public spaces? We're talking sort of parks, we're talking gardens, we're talking trees. My experience, having previously worked for Thames Water, permeable paving, right, is a key thing. If you just concrete everything and you get a month's rainfall in a day, which has happened on repeat, certainly in London, the outcome is pretty poor, right? You're getting everything flooded, from infrastructure to homes to businesses, the whole lot. If you kind of build and develop stuff in a way that looks to the environment and looks to nature, you can still have really good quality housing, but in a way which kind of, is better for everybody in terms of all outcomes. In terms of BBOUT, and one of the things that I'm really proud of the charity for kind of pioneering, it's this idea of biodiversity net gain. So this is the idea that when developers build a development, you have to leave biodiversity in a better state than you found it. And developers can either do that on the development itself, or they can look to buy credits. And of the 7 sort of big schemes that are being run in the country at the moment, BBOUT has pioneered 2. So if you're a developer in the 3 counties and you're looking to kind of, buy these credits to offset what you've built, BBOUT will take that on and will actively manage those spaces for 30 years and beyond. So it's that balance, isn't it, about being able to kind of deliver the homes that the country needs, but not just concreting everything and doing it in a far more kind of meaningful and impactful way, I think.
And locally, what are some of the issues that wildlife is facing, and what can normal households do to help protect it?
I mean, the obvious answer to the thing that's kind of impacting wildlife is us. Without doubt. And I think by nature, I think we're quite an arrogant race, aren't we? I spend a lot of time sort of sitting there listening to people sort of talking about, all the virtues of kind of artificial intelligence and what that's going to do, and how clever we are, and that's true on a level. But I also can't help but sit there and think to myself, yeah, but without nature, we're done for. without, we're not going to be able to kind of grow the food that we need to eat. There's going to be no water left in the water cycle. I mean, human life, is a very extreme example, but ultimately ceases to function at that point, right? So, I think there's a challenge around us and kind of the way that we behave. However, I don't subscribe to the view that doing nothing because it can't affect the ultimate kind of outcome is also the right way of looking at it, basically. And people say, well, I don't know, China, India, continue to emit huge volumes of CO2 into the environment. It doesn't matter what we do because that's going to, sort of override it all. I take a very sort of bottom-up view on a lot of this stuff, which is that if everybody makes, small tweaks to what they're doing and how they operate in their daily lives, that ladders up to something. And so, if you go onto the BBOUT website, there's some really good sort of tutorials, kind of proper Blue Peter style tutorials around, how you can build kind of like, bat boxes or, how you can, come up with vegetable gardens or log shelters using kind of existing materials that you've already got around the house. Because, again, I think the other challenge that people that are passionate about this kind of have to overcome is this kind of sort of prevailing narrative around everybody should buy an EV. Everybody should buy an EV, and everybody should change their diet. And, and if we don't all do those things immediately, then, it's kind of game over. And actually, it's kind of tone deaf because so many people don't have access to a drive. So many people can't even afford to buy a charging point, right? Let alone, an EV. It's a very sort of, dare I say, kind of a very middle class sort of way of looking at the problem. But there are things that you can do, which everybody can do, which ultimately will ladder up to something. So go and have a look on our website. Shameless promotion here, but go and have a look on our website. There's some really cool, interesting things that people can do.
One of my neighbours, they've created an insect hotel in their back garden, and it's just made through like broken pots and old twigs and things like that they've just found around, so it's inexpensive. And it's just impressive to see, and they've got all sorts of things in there. So it doesn't need to be expensive or take up a huge amount of space, but that's how they're contributing to wildlife, which is brilliant. And I was very impressed to learn that BBOUT's got about 1,700 volunteers, which is incredible. And I want to know, what do they spend most of their time doing? Who do they tend to be? And how can people get involved?
You are absolutely right, in the sense that it is incredible. I mean, the charity would cease to function, essentially, without kind of this volunteer army that exists. And again, shameless plug, but if you go on the website, it's all very clearly laid out. There's really good kind of videos on there and sort of information about how to kind of get involved and what that kind of looks like. And it's not all just going out and sort of doing things on the land, albeit there is a lot of that kind of goes on. So going out with our sort of land management teams and helping to sort of clear shrub and, basically keep sort of the reserves in a good kind of working order. But there's also people that come to us with other skills, whatever they may be, sort of IT skills or whatever, marketing skills, which, the team can then use and sort of put to good use. I mean, we're a charity kind of after all. And these are people that actually kind of come from all walks of life, which is, a really kind of wonderful thing to see, to be honest. There are a lot of people that have kind of come along and volunteered their time that, or obviously have more time and are retired and have, sort of gone and had their careers and done that. There are people who find a spare couple of hours in the week in the middle of sort of big, sort of demanding kind of jobs that they do. There's people who actually, benefit health-wise from being outdoors and in nature that come along and get sort of a double benefit of doing something meaningful and at the same time sort of deriving sort of all the health benefits of kind of being outdoors and in sort of green open space. So you can't really sort of pigeonhole it. But again, anybody that sort of wants to get involved and wants to help, I would encourage people to sort of have a look, because there's always the need for people to come and help support with all of these things. And, I think there's a whole...
Are they making habitats for wildlife? Are they clearing foliage? What do they tend to be doing? All
of those kind of wonderful things that you've sort of described there, to be perfectly honest. it kind of just comes along with in terms of, what's the need, what is it that we've got at the moment that we need sort of help and support with, which obviously tends not to be sort of the specialist stuff that we would use our, sort of our rangers or our, our specialist kind of contractors for, but actually how do we kind of manage that and what does that look like? And there's a whole sort of series of things that we do to sort of support that. There's a specific kind of volunteer newsletter at the AGM every October. We sort of have awards for people who have volunteered and done sort of, wonderful things for the organisation. So when I talk to volunteers, it's a very rewarding thing. People always come away and think that they've felt like they've made a bit of a difference to their kind of local community. And that's just a really lovely thing to see, right?
It's so important to reward people who are doing great things for the community. So I'm so glad that you have those awards for them. I'm really interested also to know, what have you learned during your time at BBOUT? If this is something you've learned about wildlife that was surprising, or perhaps something that was just really memorable.
I think at the moment, the big sort of takeaway is just how difficult it is to run a charity. I think, as you said at the top, I've spent a lot of my career kind of in various sort of corporate roles. And, if there are challenges to kind of income, business has got a whole range of levers, as you well know, that you can pull to try and sort of affect change. The same is not necessarily true of the charitable sector, and sort of think about the challenges sort of facing us, but other charities at the moment. You've got a challenge rather around, sort of access to specifically government grants. Since Brexit, when everybody was sort of told that, don't worry, it will all be fine. There've been various sort of iterations of grants that have sort of come and gone, and that makes your financial planning very difficult. The decisions that you're taking over managing and using land obviously take time. It's not stuff that you can just sort of turn on and off. So that makes it kind of challenging. While we've got the largest membership base of any wildlife trust, which is amazing in itself, the option to just go and sort of, whack up membership fees is not something I don't think that anybody's, interested in doing. We fully appreciate, times are tough, and that's not a road that anybody necessarily sort of wants to go down, sort of at the upper end. And then you've got challenges around things like legacies, which, very, very morbid for a nice sunny day. But, if I decide to leave money to the charity in my will and I live for another 50, 60 years, it's not being realised. And how do you build that into a financial plan ultimately? So you've got all of these kind of competing factors at the moment, which mean that actually sort of running the organisation is quite difficult actually, and is quite challenging, and things perhaps I hadn't needed to really think about, I suppose, until I sort of took this role on. But more power to our CEO and our executive team, because they do a really good job of managing all of this stuff when there are so many kind of unknowns in that process.
And BBOUT's got 150 staff, which is a good number of people to be on the payroll. And also you've got all these sites as well. So I can understand the challenge. But what are you focusing on now at BBOUT, and how can people find the charity online?
So find the charity online, any good search engine, BBOUT, and it will appear. Really good website, huge amounts of information about all the reserves that you can go to. I've sort of touched on the stuff around kind of volunteering opportunities, and there'll also be on there kind of our sort of strategic plans in terms of what we're trying to achieve. I think the big thing at the moment is reviewing that strategy, and ensuring that it's the right strategy for the charity kind of into the medium to long term. I think when the current iteration was sort of completed in around sort of 2021, which was just literally as I was joining the board, clearly the world was quite a different place. So quite a lot of thought being given to what needs to go into that, and what we need to continue to do. But also, I think, challenging ourselves to say, actually, what's going to have the most impact? And actually, where are we best putting, our expert team and our expert resource? And the organisation does so much. It does look after all these, wonderful nature reserves for people. It's got, sort of the BNG thing that I was talking about in terms of being able to provide those credits. The education program is phenomenal. 12,000 school children we get to every year, talking about the importance of kind of wildlife and nature. There's a lot of strings to the bow, but it's making sure, obviously, that we can continue to sort of deliver those for the benefit of the 3 counties. So that's the real focus at the moment.
And I'm also a fan of Be About's social media presence, because if you're a sucker for cute wildlife pictures, then you've got that down. So I'll plug that for you for certain. And final question, if you were Prime Minister, which law would you introduce or change, and why?
What a question. I think I'm going to be greedy. I'm going to have 2 things, because I'm Prime Minister after all, Laura, and I can decide decide such things. I think the first thing is just an acceptance of the fact that you can have growth and you can go for a growth mission, but you can do it while having kind of the environment at the heart of it. So, I'm not sure the incumbent at the moment is of that view, but I would be. And then I think the other thing that kind of leads into that we've sort of touched on is, from the government side, what can it do to provide charities like ours with the certainty that we need? And a lot of that relates to, the Department for, Food and the Environment and Rural Affairs, just really being very clear and setting out, what grant schemes it's going to hold on to, what it's not, and actually what that looks like in the long term. Because, we are looking medium to long term. It's very difficult when these things sort of happen and then they don't happen. So I think that kind of certainty is something that I would be wanting to sort of share with the wildlife trusts in general, but also everybody else across the sector. So 2 things, I think.
You're allowed it. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Miles Evans, for joining me on the Berkshire Heroes podcast. It's been lovely talking with you.
Thank you, Laura.